Okay, good morning. So we've been reviewing, we're middle of a page 1156 in volume 2 of Ayin Beis. But yesterday we just did some review. So let me review the review and continue the review and then continue on. So we're talking about levels of bittul and oir. So now we're talking about a level called heder tfisas mokim. That's the exact words. Heder tfisas mokim ba'atzmei. A level does not feel any sense of self and identity. And to appreciate it, let's look at the contrast. In human life, you can have times where you feel yourself as an identity, I'm not even talking about arrogance now. You just feel that you're significant, a sense of self. And then so that's what we identify with most. So the exact opposite of that is oir. It doesn't feel a sense of self because it's connected to and feels and senses its source. Like the examples he gave of a smaller chacham katan and a chacham gadol. So when you're in the presence of the chacham gadol, there's no sense of self. You feel insignificant. And again, insignificant here does not mean anything negative. It means there's no sense of self. That's the first level of bittul of oir that we've been discussing. But to analyze that, the Rebbe Rashab is going to what does that mean exactly? When you're talking about Atzmus. When you're talking about one gilui, like a flame in comparison to sunlight, it's understandable. You're talking about keser in comparison to ilus ha'ilus, the cause of all causes. But you're talking about Atzmus, that's completely removed. So to understand this, what does it mean, heder tfisas mokim? Heder tfisas mokim means there's something that would have been consideration of something that relates to it. Here, Atzmus is beyond gili. That's the way the question was posed. So to understand this, it goes back to a theme that we've learned earlier, especially in Tzadik Daled, but also in Ayin Beis, that oir, what is oir exactly? We know the kavana, the purpose of existence is yesh, not oir. But oir is the tool and instrument that God uses to create. And oir, on one hand, is completely bottled to, completely dedicated, without any sense of self, like I said, to Atzmus. On the other hand, it's a reflection. It doesn't have any substance. It's only ha'ara, not the etzem. So we've been talking about two sides to oir. One is its complete distance from Atzmus, and the other, which we're going to talk about now, which we didn't get to yesterday really, is how oir is a carrier of Atzmus and a perfect carrier because of its total bittul. So the first half, let's talk just what we discussed yesterday, was the ein arech. So what do we know about oir? Oir on its own reveals that there's a source for light. When you see light, even if you don't see the source, you know it's coming from somewhere. Even if you didn't see the sun and you see daylight, you know that if you follow the tracks, the light will lead you to its source. But that doesn't tell you what kind of source it is. Like he said, you can have oir that's not coming from Atzmus. The sun gives off light. A flame gives off light. So how do we know about Atzmus? The yesh of Elam Haza, Ein Arech L'cha B'Elam Haza, tells you, oh, God is creating something that's something that doesn't reveal him. So that tells you that Atzmus is a completely beyond anything called Gilui and oir. And that in turn tells you that oir itself is also Shalei Berach. Why? Because it's something that you realize God is beyond being a source for light. So in that sense, he says, Mamish, Kamoy, Shayeshu be'en arech, Kamoy Kain, Gama Eir be'en arech. That's where we stopped yesterday in the review. But now comes the other side of the coin. Does that mean Eir and Yesh are synonymous? No. It means in their ein arech, when you understand what Atzmus really is, so Eir, Yesh, and anything for that matter, is not the source. Everything has a source. So nothing is like Atzmus. But God did create Eir and Yesh. They didn't call them the same name, and they don't have the same properties. So just because everything is equalized before Atzmus doesn't mean that everything is equal in its own identity. Everything has its own function. So now what is Eir, what is Er's so-called personality. So he continues. And again, we read this already, so but I'll just I'm reviewing, so I'll choose select lines. This is 3 lines from the bottom of page 1155. I should mention, if you want to follow the text and you don't have it, just go to ayinbeis.com and you have all the PDFs of these pages. Ayinbeis.com. It says, Mekol Mokim, on the other hand, nevertheless, in other words, the way God emanated light is different than the way he emanated the yesh. And I want to emphasize again, this does not make Eir closer to Atzmus than the yesh. It just means God did different ways. He could have different tracks of how he so-called expresses his power. Just like he can create a daimim, Tzemeach, Chaim, Medaber, and all of them are equally distant from Atzmus, but the daimim is not a Tzemeach and a Chai is not a Medaber. So he says like this. So the way the Metzias of Eir from Atzmus does not come in the derech of Ein Arech. So it's interesting, in other words. Its existence is infinitely distant from Atzmus, the existence of Eir, like Yesh. But the way Eir manifests is in a way that's more revealing of Atzmus than it is of complete Ein Arech. So he's going to explain. The Masha Atzmus Nikra Beira, when he's saying Atzmus is called a creator. Why? Because only Atzmus can create. That we've learned. That's based on the Geras HaKedesh. Hu levade b'keiche. He's the only one that can create. Eir cannot create because Eir itself is a creation. Eir can carry the creative force, energy, but it's not a creator. So the only beta is Atzmus. But when you call him beta, by definition, you say beta and nivra, meaning creator and creation. That is an Ein Arech experience, because there's nothing in common between a creator and a creation. All you can say, it's a product of this creator, but you cannot say that the nivra reflects the creator. It has properties that can teach us about Atzmus, like we learned. But a beta and nivra is not only the Ein Arech in existence, but also its identity as a beta and a nivra is b'derech Ein Arech. And he says in the parentheses, again, this is just to refresh, Hainu she'esavis, last line on page 1155, going over to 1156, Hainu she'esavis b'derech Ein Arech. In other words, the way God created something, he didn't create it in stages. Even though it's true there's a Seder Shtalshelus, which goes from the Tzimtzum and the Kav and Ak and all the levels until it gets to Asiyah, the creation of this world. But the creation itself, as we said many times, we said it here explicitly, that as much as you diminish Ruchnius, meaning spiritual energy, it doesn't become Gashmis. That leap from Ruach to Geshem, meaning from spiritual energy to Geshem, needs a boire. So that's a leap. So even though the Shtalshel does diminish the Eir, but there's a leap between the two. That's why we say, just to give an example, we say on the Neshama and the Guf, the body and the soul. So of course the soul goes through many levels of diminishment to be able to be mislabish, enclose itself in the body. That's a given. But the soul doesn't create the body. Because the soul and body, no matter how much you diminish the soul, it doesn't become a body. No matter how much you diminish energy, it doesn't become matter. I should correct myself. In physics, that may not be the case. But I'm talking about here divine energy. So you need what we say, koyach hamafli lases. The power hamafli lases, the awesome power, the wondrous power of God to create, to bind soul and body together. So the way Chassidus explains it is that the Eibishter wanted it to be in a logical process. So therefore, he makes that the neshama and guf come closer to each other. But you always need that one spark, that one power that creates the bond. Why would a soul and a body join as one? That has to be something higher than the neshama and higher than the guf. So same thing you could say regarding Bria. Beira can only come from Atzmus, but the way the Beira creates is an Ein Arech, it's a leap. In the parentheses, he says, Hainu, she'isavasi b'derech ein arech. That means the creation is in a form of this leap. Levadzes, shayesh atzmei hu be'ein arech. So basically, two things. What's a levadzes? Levadzes goes back to what we said before, that if you compare the pure firepower, so to speak, of a yesh to Atzmus, or for that matter, Oir, it's ein arech. That's its mere existence. It's ein arech because Atzmus is beyond everything. But if you talk about the derech efen isavus, that's important here, derech ein arech, the way it's manifests. There's a difference between Oir and yesh. We'll get to Oir in a minute. The yesh, even its way of being created, is not through, what's the word I want to use? Through progressive steps. There's a leap. Yesh ma'ayin. Bria, the Boira is create something. However, Avlisav Sa'ir, the top of page 1156, Mina Atzmus eina b'derech ein arech. Its Metzias is ein arech, because everything is ein arech compared to Atzmus as the Yesh reveals. But its way, its manner of merging is not in a infinite leap. The Eir hu ein arech klal gaba Atzmus, Avlisavusa eina b'derech ein arech. The Eir itself is ein arech, like we just learned in the first half of the story, that the Eir is completely distant because God is not defined by being a source of light. He's not a sun, God forbid. So in that sense, the existence of Eir is as distant from Atzmus as Yesh is. However, Avlisavuse, the way, the manner in which it emerges is not bein arech. The imne yesh she'ein zeh b'chinas kiruv ha'atzmus, even though you can't call it a kiruv, the Atzmus, because they are infinitely distant. Now he doesn't explain this yet. He's going to explain this now with an example, which we're going to review in a moment, between Ratzon, between desire, the power of Koyach HaRatzon, and the Koyachis Pnimim, the internal and immanent faculties of a human being. But the statement is made that there's a difference between its existence and there's a difference the way it comes into existence. So I'm not going to explain it because he's going to explain it inside. Obviously, the explanation is going to be based on the fact that Oyer carries Gilui. By definition, Oyer reveals whatever it came from. It doesn't reveal the infinite power of Atzmus, how Atzmus is beyond everything, but it definitely reveals something. A Yesh doesn't reveal anything. A Yesh, you need to use your Seichel to start extrapolating and saying, oh, where did this come from? So like I mentioned yesterday, if you saw, for example, I just came a crazy marshal. You see on a beach. So if you see water on the beach, it's very easy for you to identify where the water is coming from. It's coming from the sea, from the ocean. If you see another object on the beach that's not water, you realize that it's coming from some place that is not defined by water. The water may have carried it there. My point I'm making here is that both of them can be infinitely distant from the, obviously this example is inadequate because water and the ocean are similar. But the same idea, so from Atzmus, many things can come. Some things can reveal, some things conceal. They're both equally distant. So if you were to say God has the power, the capacity, we wrote the Yechelis, Lahoyer, to give off light. God has the capacity to reveal part of himself, to reveal whatever it reveals, to reveal his intentions. And then he has the power not to reveal. So from the point of view of distance, they're both equally distant. But yet one functions as a revealer and one functions as a concealer. So though they both are infinitely distant from the source, because the source is not defined by Oir and not defined by Heder Oir. He's not defined by shining, he's not defined by not shining, unlike a sun, for instance. But that doesn't mean that he cannot express himself in different ways. Oir, at the end of the day, as we're going to learn, its expression is not an enarech expression. It ultimately is a revealer. Does it reveal what Atzmus really is? No. That you need the yesh. But to say that it doesn't reveal anything is not correct. It tells you that there's a source. Oir is always testifying to a source. Now we're going to learn more about this. Now we're going to go into the muscle. So if you don't get it yet, That's fine, because the Rebbe Rashab didn't fully explain it. He just made the statement and didn't explain what does that mean, that its mitzias is ein arech, but its derech hayesavus, its way of emerging is not ein arech, even though it's not kiruv, but he says also it's not ein arech. What does that mean exactly? We're going to learn in the next 2 pages. So now, to explain this, comes the next paragraph. This is where we went through, I believe, around halfway through the top of the page. But I'm gonna go over it again because it's worthwhile. So I'm gonna read from the beginning here again, from the top of the paragraph in Aleph Kuf Nun Vav. One short introduction. What is the point of this next paragraph? Remember, we're talking about levels that we don't have any tangible way to relate to. We only know what we're told. But Chassidus, one of the big chidushim of the Alter Rebbe, Chassidus Chabad, is mipsare echzel lekah, that from my flesh I behold God. So wherever possible, if you look in Chassidus, you'll always see, starting from the Alter Rebbe and Tanya, and throughout all of Chassidus, you see this constant effort to give examples from things that we can identify with. So when he says in Tanya, or he says in the Pasuk, first of all, we were created in the image of God, and then he says in Tanya, in chapter 3, he says that the keiches hanefesh, the shtalshlu mehen, the faculties of the human being evolve from mehen. What is mehen? The 10 spheres. So that tells you that when you look at your faculties, you can learn things about God's attributes. And they teach you things all the way to the highest levels. Obviously, again, with the qualification that there are things that Atzmus is beyond us completely. But even that, remember, the yesh, mitziusi atzmusi of the yesh, gives us some type of tangible example of what does it mean to feel like having no source. As the Alter Rebbe is mechadish in Ageres HaKedesh Simachov. That's just as an example. So now he's going to give an example with our faculties to explain 2 ways the soul manifests. So though the soul is beyond all faculties, in this case, like Atzmus, even though, let's make it clear, soul and Atzmus are not the same thing, but as a moshel. So the soul is equidistant from, let's say, Ratzon, which expresses the desire of the soul, and Chochma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Chayid, Yesed, Malchus. So they could be equally distant from the soul, and yet the manifestation of the soul, as we're going to learn now in the Ratzon, is far more closer. Ratzon's closer, so to speak, to the Nefesh. Maybe that's not the right word, not closer. It's more revealing of what the Nefesh is than a particular faculty. So I'm just giving an overview. So for example, if I say to you, if you look at a person, you say, what kind of person is this person? And you look at their intelligence, and you come away saying, hey, pretty intelligent person, a scholar, a Talmid Chacham, or less than a Talmid Chacham. So what do you know about the person right now? You know about their faculty. You don't know. You can't say, I know what this person is really made of. Then you study the emotions of the person. You see a Baal Chesed, a kind person, a Baal Gvura, a disciplined person. I'm not talking about necessarily negative traits right now, just characteristics. And you can come away with a picture of the Koiches HaNefesh from Chochma, Bina, through Malchus, in the cognitive, the emotional, and behavioral realms of this person. But if someone will say, okay, so now do we know who the person really is? You'll say, not necessarily. I know what their faculties are, the person's faculties are like. But there's a whole part of a human being that may not be revealed through the faculties. When you come to see someone's rotzen, you see, what do they desire? Where is their passion? Where are they invested in? Not a particular instrument, whether they're smart or emotional or chesed or gvura or chachma or bina. There are people who are chachamim, who innovate, bina, who comprehend well, etc., etc. You want to get closer to reflect what does this person make them tick. You want to see their rotzen. So, for example, if you came to Farbrengen and you heard the Rebbe speak, you could hear a lot about the Rebbe's wisdom, his chachma, his go'enis, his knowledge of Torah, his knowledge of the world. But where do you see the Rebbe much more in his rotzen? What means his rotzen? What he wants. He wants to make a dira b'tachtenim, der hashvi, to bring Mashiach, v'shechanti b'seicham. So though he uses his chachma bina das and all his faculties to fulfill the mission, but the Ratzon is far more reflective of the mission of the entire human being than the Keiches are. So the Keiches are the way you implement, but the Ratzon reflects most of what's going on in the nefesh of that individual. So we're going to learn in the Oisius of the Rebbe Rashab. I just wanted to say it in simple, basic language. But that doesn't make Ratzon less ein harech from the nefesh. It just means that Ratzon has a power to reveal more of who you are, but doesn't make it closer to the etzem hanefesh. That's the key thing to remember, which we're going to learn now, as I said, inside. So,
the Keiches don't necessarily.
One second. It's going to be an example to help us understand the point that we're talking about. Ir and yesh, both are ein harech from Atzmus. That's clear. But the hisavas, the way they emerge from Atzmus and what their function is different. You want to ask something?
The Keiches don't necessarily reflect the Ratzon at all. It could be
sorry?
The Keiches don't necessarily reflect the Ratzon at all. It could be coming from a different Ratzon.
I didn't say they don't reflect at all. They may reflect many things, but it's not as revelatory, so to speak, of the entirety of the person. Look,
it's possible not to reflect at all.
Well, you know what? I would suggest we wait till we learn it inside. Let's see what he says, and then we'll take it further. I just wanted to give an overview before we learn it inside. It would be like the equivalent of the difference between in a business plan, the mission statement, and the driving purpose of this entity, and the way you implement it. So faculties are implementers. The mission tells you reflects what the entity is all about. So like we learned about building a home. The first thing is, what kind of home do you want? In general, I want a home that a human being, the same thing with Lamayla, wants a desire for a home, a ratzon for a home, but you don't have any details. What kind of home? How large? What will be made of? So ratzon reflects a lot more what your essence, you need to have a home. A human being is not complete without a home. But there are many different types of homes. And the faculties are more reflective of the specifics, and the ratzon is more reflective of the general desire of that picture. But let's learn it inside. And then, of course, it's all coming to explain, as I said, the difference between Ir and Yesh. She says like this, V'yesh levayah. V'yesh levayah zeh. And we can explain this. Explain what? The difference between Ir and Yesh, how Ir, even though it's ein harech, because Atzmus is beyond everything equally, but its manner of expression, the way it emerges from Atzmus, is not ein harech. And all this, I should mention, is coming to explain the question. So how do we say heder tfisas mokim and oir l'gaba Atzmus when Atzmus is beyond oir? So answering the question that we're just proposing now, or explaining how oir has some relationship with Atzmus in its manner of emergence, it's a derech esavos, is going to help us understand how we could say heder tfisas mokim in the initial question. So it's essentially explaining the properties of oir will explain to us the initial point he wants to make in this eifin habittul. So that's the logical flow here. So he says, "Yesh levayah al derech mashen isbar le'il be'inyan ratzon v'seichel." We can explain this al derech, meaning similar to what was discussed earlier, what was explained earlier, in the idea of ratzon and seichel. What was said? The ratzon einei chutz la'atzmus hanefesh. The ratzon is not outside of atzmus hanefesh. The seichel hu koyach shel chutz la'atzmus hanefesh. That was what we learned earlier, and he's going to explain this, of course. So both are not atzmus hanefesh. Let's make that clear. They're both not atzmus hanefesh. Atzmus hanefesh is the essence of a person's soul, but one's location is not outside of atzmus hanefesh, and the other's location is outside. Now, outside here doesn't mean physical space, obviously. It means conceptually outside of. And we'll learn inside, and then we'll explain. maybe I should just say a few words about this before we read further. So when we say it's not outside of Atzmus HaNefesh, because as I explained, for example, with chief of staff, if you have a king, you have a chief of staff, you have different departments, the cooking department, the mail department, the finance department, the defense department. I mean, you have many departments, so to speak. But you have the chief of staff. So the king is the king. Who's inside of the king's chamber, meaning not chutz la'atzmus hanefesh of the king? Who's there? The chief of staff, because he spends time with the king every day. They meet. He goes into the king's inner chamber. The king tells him what he wants. He then goes out from that inner chamber and gives orders, the king's orders, to each department head, who in turn takes his team and implements it. So this is a normal process of a hierarchy from the king all the way. Now, if you ask, each one, they're all fulfilling the king's desire. But the difference is, the chief of staff job is not to be going in the field and each department and figuring out what's going on. There may be people to do that, people who audit, who oversee. His role is only one thing. Tell me what you want. Rotzen HaMelech, basically. So the chief of staff, you could say, is the Rotzen. Is it Atzmus HaNefesh? No, there's only one king. But is it outside of Atzmus HaNefesh? Is he in one specific territory? No. On the other hand, the head of a department doesn't belong in the inner chamber because he won't get the job done. He has to go out. If, let's say, he's dealing with the gardening or the taxation or the defense of the empire, his job is not to remain in the palace. He has to go there. So technically speaking, there in the physical sense of the word, the chief of staff is in the inner sanctum and domain together with the king. The heads of the departments are out there in the field with whatever department they are running and organizing. So the same thing in Nefesh, you could say the Nefesh is like the king, that's Atzmus HaNefesh. Ratzon is the reflection of what this Nefesh wants without distinction. Whether you want to walk or talk or run a business or learn Torah or jump in the air or significant, Ratzon is one job and one job only, to reflect the desire of the Nefesh. On the other hand, the faculties, each of them have their particular location. Chochmah, if it was busy with just expressing the desire of the nefesh, it wouldn't do its job right. It has to focus on conceiving an idea. Obviously, it has to be aligned with the Ratzon HaMelech, meaning the Ratzon HaNefesh. This needs to be aligned. It needs to follow what the nefesh wants. But its functionality is a very specific one. Chochmah shouldn't be bina, and bina shouldn't be das, and chesed shouldn't be gvur. Each is doing their thing. Yes, they're all coordinated, they're all aligned, they're working in harmony. But the specific function they have, you can call chutz la'atzmus hanefesh. That's what he means by chutz. He doesn't mean it's foreign. He doesn't mean it's against the nefesh. He doesn't say it's against. It means its functionality, its focus is on its function. So like I mentioned many times, and let's say when you make in birchas ha-mitzvahs, a mitzvah. So a mitzvah, the bracha of a mitzvah has two parts to it. We just come from Sukkot. Asher kedushanim b'tzveis v'tzivanu al entilas lulav. The first half, Asher kedushanim b'tzveis v'tzivanu, is the rotzah. You sanctified us, mitzvesav, you commanded us. The second half, which changes from one mitzvah to the other. Hanochas tefillin is a different bracha. Lahadik ner Shabbos Kedesh is a different bracha. Al achilas matzah is not al natilas lulav. So if you focus on the kavanah klolis, the language of Chassidus, it's that you're fulfilling God's will. And in certain ways, all mitzvahs are all part of one will. But when you focus on the mitzvah, you can't be focusing on a matzah when you're taking a lulav. So on the tilas lulav has its kavanah pratis, is the mitzvah lulav. Now, obviously, lulav is aligned with Asher Kedushanim B'Tzveis V'Tzivanu, but it's taking the ratzon and turning it into a specific action, the action of taking the daled minim, or the action of taking eating a matzah, or the action of lighting a candle. So you see there that you have one, the melech, meaning in this case, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam. You have Asheka D'Shanim Tzivonu, which is the Ratzon, Klali, and then you have the Ratzon Prati, or the more than the Ratzon Prati, the implementation of a particular mitzvah. So one, you could say, the Asheka D'Shanim Tzivonu is not Chutz Atzmus HaNefesh, in the example I gave before. And however, the actual performance of a specific detail is chutz, because that's the kavanah, that it should be a lulav and not a matzah, or whatever other mitzvah you're talking about. Just trying to explain it in ways that we can relate to. So now he's going to go further and deeper in this, which again, we learned already, but it's worthwhile learning again, that's for sure. He says, "U'kamoy kein yuvan." Okay, I explained this before Yom Tov, last classes we gave before the break we took, that he's going now to explain even deeper and further. Not only is Ratzon not outside of the Atzmus HaNefesh, like I just explained, it's meaning that its role is to reflect what the Nefesh wants, whereas Seichel, which he's just using one example, it could have been Midas, but he's using Seichel, the highest faculty, is a koyach that's so-called expressed outside of the Atzmus HaNefesh, it's a specific, defined function. He says the same thing we're going to now talk about is how these faculties come not just from Atzmus HaNefesh, but from the koyches Atzmim. So if you may recall what I explained, if not, I'm going to go over it again now. So before I continue, I have to spell it out. And it's really a very fundamental piece in understanding in general. As I said before, our faculties teach us about how godliness works. If you remember, we discussed at length in previous Maimer, we talked about how from a Poshet, a completely seamless and shapeless Ein Sof, with no identity, begins to emerge. First is the Heskim, a consideration for creation. And then came a Shakavatari, a deliberation. And then came Achlota, a determination. And that in turn turns into a Ratzon Prati, where we start thinking about what God starts thinking about what specifics. Up to the Ratzon HaKodem, which is the Shir Atzmei B'Keach, where he allocates the resources necessary. Now, of course, we know, and we've said so many times, God doesn't need any of these levels. Can go straight from Atzmus straight to creation. But he wanted us to have a logical process that we can emulate. Firstly, we can understand, we can emulate, and we can retrace the steps. I say that again and again because it's very important to always know that statement. So therefore, when we understand the process, how a human being functions, how does any entity or any decision we make, how does it evolve from the deepest part of your soul into an action? Using the example of building a home. Like we've learned, you can go for years and not have any interest in having a home. Children don't necessarily think about having their own home. But there comes a point where that part of your nefesh emerges that I want to now find a home, build a home, buy a home. So it's fascinating to dissect the steps. How do you get from the point of conception all the way to the end process of actually building or purchasing the home? That process teaches us how it is also lamaila in the levels of the Elokus. So to do so, the way Chassidus explains it is that the nefesh is, in the sense, essentially the engine room, if you wish. So that's the life force, is the chelik elikam mal mamish, however you want to define it. It's the soul that was created in the image of God. By yipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. I mean, sometimes I like to explain, if you want to speak in real plain English, what is a soul? A soul is God's desire of what your life should be. So it doesn't begin first you're alive, you're born, and you live, and then God says, okay, let's figure out what this person's role is. It's the other way around. The cosmic engineer, for lack of a better word, or let's use it, the cosmic artist, first envisioned a large mission he wants. Adira b'tachtein. Sava Kadosh Baruch Hu to have a dira b'tachtein. And then came the process of building it, and then came who is going to now implement this dira b'tachtein. That's going to be the human being created on Rosh Hashanah. Adam and Chav. I'll put them into the garden, into the world I created, God says. La'avda l'shamra. They are the executors of my mission. They will implement it. And God gives them all the resources to do so. So God's thinking, think of God as the artist or the architect, whatever word you want to use. When he envisions Adam and Chava, we're starting with them, and then it really goes into every human being. That is their neshama. When it says God blew, breathed, instilled, vayipak ba'apav nishmas chayim, what does that mean? It's not a physical breath. It means he imparted part of his plan, or let's put it this way, or maybe all of his plan, into a human being to be able to fulfill that plan. So the human being is created with the spirit of the artist infused in him. So it's another way of saying an artist is infusing his art with his intentions. So in a way, you can say a soul is God's intention for us. I know you may never have heard it explained this way, and I'm not saying it's the definition of neshama purely. Neshama is actually breath of God, but if you want to put it into palpable terms, or is it palatable? Maybe both work here. Into terms that we can relate to, it would be like saying the author writes a book, but the book, the letters and the words and the paragraphs and the chapters are reflective of what he wants to convey. So you could say the soul of the book is what? Is the author's intentions in what his message is. Now, I don't want to go into a discussion. Why can't you say the same thing about a tree and a bird and the sky? Aren't they also expressions of God's intentions? That's correct, they are. But they're a piece. Whereas the human being is the one that brings it all together. The sounds of New York you're hearing in the background. Okay, so in that sense, then you could say that the Atzmus HaNefesh or a neshama is essentially I'm looking for I don't want to say a ball of energy. I don't like the word ball, but I think you know what I'm saying. It's like it manifests basically the essential nature and the essential purpose of a human being, and it's in the form of a neshama. A neshama, but you can't say the neshama is defined, for example, by the fact that it gives life. That's one aspect of it. Yes, it's a nefesh chaya. It gives life. Why can't you say that's enough? Because that would be called nefesh, not ruach neshama chaya yechida. What about the moichin, the intelligence? What about the midas? What about the rotzen? What about the tainug? So to say that a soul, all it is to give life to a body, that's the biological dimension of the soul. If you want to go deeper, you have to find deeper dimensions. But what about the whole soul? We say etzem hanefesh. It says chamisha shemes nikra law. It's given it's 5 names. You call it by 5 names. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chay, yechidus. Says Chassidus, the fact that you say nikru law means there's a 6th level, which is the nefesh itself. 6. I don't want to call it a 6th level. They don't say it's a 6th level, meaning it's something beyond the 5 levels. That this neshama is called by 5 names from the bottom up. Nefesh is like biological, ruach is emotional, neshama is intellectual, chay is more like rotzen, transcendent, and yechid is etzem hanefesh that we talk about Yom Kippur. But we say etzem hanefesh, yechid is still a name. So then there's a level that's not even called yechid. The point I want to make here is that the nefesh is really, in many ways, again, big qualification. It's not like Atzmus, because the nefesh and the neshama is not Atzmus, but it has a certain feature of a very all-encompassing nature that cannot be defined by the sum of its parts. So if someone were to ask you, what is a neshama? You can't say a neshama is a sum of a bunch of parts and saying, like a house, you could say, yes, a house is made of bricks and mortar and it has rooms in it and it's the sum of the parts. The purpose of the house, obviously, is beyond the sum of the parts, to live there, to learn, to make it a mishkan, shchanti b'seicham. But when you talk about the nefesh, it's not a sum of its parts. The nefesh is God's energy manifest in the human being, b'tselem elikim, and then the nefesh has different functions. So essentially, the nefesh is then the function of tainug and rotzen and moichin and midas and nihi, ma'aseh b'peil, bringing it down into the behavioral. So what we're going to learn now, what he's going to say now, is how does this process work? How does it work from the nefesh? How does it get into specifics? Very much to reflect and explain. The same thing lamaila. The same thing with the keiches, how from rotzen gets to chochmah, and how they have different relationships with the etzem nefesh. So the etzem nefesh, let's make it clear again, is beyond all levels. But as you can understand, when a Jew goes on Mesidus Nefesh, which is Yechidah Shebenefesh, it's far more reflective of his Etzem Nefesh than when he's sitting and doing a specific function of even learning or doing a tzedakah. Not to take away from learning Torah or doing mitzvah, but we say Mesidus Nefesh, that's where you see the revelation of Etzem Nefesh. Why is that the case? Why is the Etzem Nefesh not there when you're learning Torah and doing a mitzvah? It is, but the Mesidus Nefesh reflects more of who you fundamentally are. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that even a kal shebekalim, when he's pushed and pressured, suddenly the etzem gets revealed. So this doesn't mean you can't bring Mesidus Nefesh into learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. But Torah itself on its own only tells you about the chokhmah of your nefesh. And whereas Mesidus Nefesh reflects much more of the etzem nefesh. Just to give a little overview. Now the question is, the discussion now is, how does it travel? If the etzem nefesh is here, how does that become suddenly a specific faculty? So what Chassidus explains it is that, and working from the bottom up, that the body is the body. Remember, a body without a soul is lifeless. But a body with a soul is alive, and not just alive, it has faculties. So those faculties, those keiches, hanefesh, each one manifests in a particular container within the human body. Power of vision in the eye, the power of hearing in the ear, the power of intelligence in the brain, emotions in the heart. So they each have their locality, their location, which is essentially a oyer and a keli. That's the language lamaila, in God's attributes. Lamata, by us, the language is koyach and aver, the faculty and the limb or organ in which it manifests. So koyach and aver essentially is a oyer and a keli. Oyer hariyah or koyach hariyah in the physical eye, in the klei ha'ayin, would be the typical example. Or oyer ha'seichel in klei ha'moyach. Okay, that's the faculties. And then there's, of course, rotzen, which we'll get to soon. So the faculty, the way Chassidus explains it, is there's keiches geluyim. Keiches geluyim means functional and revealed faculties. I'm right now speaking, you're hearing me, you see me, I see you. The faculties we're using right now are revealed. If I asked you right now, do you have the power to throw something, to throw a stone? You say, of course I have the power. I say, where is it? I don't see it. I only see your face. I see us learning Ayin Beis. The answer would be, it's a koyach nelam. When it's not functioning, it's there, but it restates in the state what's called koyches nelamim. So when we're asleep, for example, as Chassidus explains, most of the koyches are at minimal functionality. Some go into complete helam, some go partial helam. But you can't say they're not there. So Chassidus explains, koyches gluyim is when the faculties are fully functional and revealed. And I say fully doesn't mean they can't grow, but I mean that it's an obvious faculty at work. Koyach nelam means it's in a state of concealment, but then we go backwards and deeper in, beyond koyches nelamim, and I'll just mention for the record, he doesn't say it here, but comes koyches hiyulim. And higher than that are koyches atzmin. And that's what we're going to discuss, Koiches Atzmim. That's why I'm elaborating so much. So what are we saying right now? Koiches Atzmim. I'll explain the difference in a moment. And all the way back to the Koiches Haklulim B'Nefesh, which is essentially Koiches Atzmim, the way they're in the Nefesh. And then there's the way they are, what we call Nefesh Neise Koiches. That the Nefesh, before it went through this whole process, until it becomes a koyach goli, a functional faculty, it was neisa keches. The nefesh, like we spoke about Atzmus, has the capacity to do many different things, but it's no way yet manifest in any form. Koiches atzmim, even though they're completely the way they are on the level of the soul, they have not expressed themselves, but they're already called koiches. You don't say nefesh neisa keches. Nefesh neisa keches means it's the nefesh, and that nefesh has yechelis, or the capacity for faculties. Koiches atzmim means how those faculties reside within the etzem nefesh. Koiches hiyulim would be there now beginning to already take on some form and shape, or at least of a source, a very amorphous or very nebulous source for the faculties. Koiches nalamim, as I said, is already a faculty, it just happens to be concealed. And a koyach goli, koiches gluyim, is when they become completely revealed. So essentially, if you were to trace back the steps, you could say the power to see. So when your eyes are open and you're looking at something, that's a koyach goli. When you close your eyes, it's a koyach nelam. It's there, you can open your eyes and right away it'll be functional. When you're asleep or your eyes are blurred, koyach hiyuli would be a type of archetype of the power of vision. So it's not quite in the etzem nefesh, but it's not, you can't call it a koyach nelam either. It's more of like where the koyach nelam gets that power from. A koyach atzmi is the way the power of vision is completely within the soul, which means it doesn't have any manifestation. And Chassidus gives an example for that, that two blind people, even born blind, will give birth to a seeing child. How is that possible? Because in the etzem nefesh, the koyach hariyah is intact. Even if there's something that, God forbid, compromised, the koyach hanelam, or the koyach hayuli, the koyach hanelam, or the koyach hagoli, that doesn't mean your etzem nefesh is in any way impaired. So that's why you can give birth to a child. A person can give birth to a child, even though they may have an optic nerve issue. They may have the keli may be an issue. Now I understand there are exceptions, of course, because people can inherit a genetic flaw. You know, for example, that's possible, but it's also not possible. Meaning you could have people who their functionality is not there, but it doesn't mean they don't have the strength and the power. Look, if somebody, for example, just to use an example, gets paralyzed, Chwan al-Islam, people in the 50s had polio, so an arm, a leg is not functioning. You think their child, God forbid, is going to have a paralyzed arm? No. What's that have to do with it? Because there, it was the koyach goli or the koyach nelem or the aver, for that matter, the keli that was damaged. It was not the etzem power of that a person has because they're paralyzed, it's just because they can't implement it. But that doesn't mean the koyach is not there. God forbid, when people have a stroke, and they want to speak or something else, it's just not able to express. That doesn't mean they don't have the koiches hanefesh. So my point that I'm trying to make is that the faculties, as we see them, if you trace them back, you go through koiches gluyim, nalamim. I'm just mentioning for the record, sometimes hiyulim, atzmim, all the way to the etzem hanefesh, nefesh neisa koiches. And then there's, of course, the nefesh beyond koiches altogether, which just to fill the picture. Once we have this introduction, it'll be a lot easier to understand what he's going to say right now. But somebody wants to ask anything or say something? Okay. So I wanted to give this introduction. He's going to use now koiches atzmim. And if not understanding what I just said, it becomes very hard to, what does he mean here? So he says, U'kamoy ken yuvan, be'inyan mitzias ha'seichel va'rotzen, ma koiches ha'atzmim shalahem. Koiches atzmim shalahem. So he's saying now, we established, or we said the statement that Ratzon is not chutz la'atzmus hanefesh, and Seichel is. That was the first line. But now he's saying, what is the relationship between the existent functional Seichel? Seichel that we are actively involved in, and it's koyach atzmi, meaning how seichel resides within the nefesh, the etzem nefesh. And what is the difference between that and how rotzen, a revealed faculty called rotzen, you're an active desire, and how does that relate to its koyach atzmi in the nefesh? So he's going to say there's a difference. The seichel goli, meaning the seichel, the functional intelligence, comes b'derech nivdal in a way like separated from, like a leap, somewhat disconnected. Mashenkin arotzen, and rotzen does not. So in other words, when someone says, "I want a home," I desire a home. So yes, it's a rotzen goli. It's an active. Koyach harotzen is active and stating what it desires. Its relationship with the rotzen and the etzem nefesh is closer, is reflecting what the etzem nefesh wants, what the person wants, because ein adam b'loy bayis, a person can't be complete without a home. So the rotzen goli and the rotzen atzmi, or that's called the rotzen as it's rooted in the koyches atzmim, are not nivdal. Seichel, on the other hand, he says, is not only is it not reflective of etzem nefesh because it's a specific faculty, like I discussed earlier, but the way it merges from koyches atzmim is with a leap. And he's going to explain now what that means. But I just want to pause for a moment if anybody wants to ask anything, because it's a pretty dense conversation, and you see why it was important to give that whole introduction, or else this lines, like, how do you explain them? We have to understand what he's talking about here. So he's basically coming to explain that specific faculties like seichel are not reflective in a direct way of the full picture of what it's like inside the nefesh. That doesn't mean they don't that, but and specifically that's their function. Like I said before, with al natilas lulav, you shouldn't be thinking about matzah. That's not its purpose. Right now, you're making a mitzvah on the daled minim. So you talk about rotzen klali, the rotzen Hashem. Yes, there's a rotzen for lulav and a rotzen for matzah. But if you were focusing on matzah during lulav, during the brichas and natilas lulav, it's a shayla on the mitzvah even. All depends on the opinions, how much kavan is negeya. But my point is, everything has its function. So this is not in a way to disparage chochmah, bina, seichel. It's just saying seichel is the functionality. It's going back to the example with the chief of staff. If the person who's supposed to be running the military or the taxation or whatever it may be, the finance, decides they want to be the chief of staff, we're not going to have a functional empire here. We're not going to have a functional system because everyone has their role. Their role is to go get the job done. So seichel's role is to get the job done through seichel, midas through midas. Ratzen's role is to make sure, it's called quality control, a reality check of making sure this is what the nefesh wants. So each has its own function. So everything comes from the nefesh, obviously, but the way and the roles they play are different. We're going to learn a little later that is like Ratzen, and the rest of the shtalshlus, like the spheres and so on, ultimately is the product or the instruments that create the product, and they're very different. When we say Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'sa'aretz, Bereshis nami maimerhu, it says Basar Mamaris Nivra Elam, right? The Mishnah says, with 10 statements, God created the world. We count the statements, there's only 9. As the Gemara, where's the 10th? So it says, Bereshis nami maimerhu. Bereshis itself is also a maimer. But then they explain that Bereshis is a very different type of statement than the rest. Yehi Oyer is specific, creating light. Bereshis is creating everything. Like Rashi says, everything was created in one like nucleus, and then it emerged. But if you only had Bereshis, and you didn't have Yehi Oyer and Yehi Rakia and Tetzi Eres Desha and Yehi Ame'eris, and all the way to Nasa Adam B'Tzalmenu, what would you have? You'd have a general desire, but you wouldn't have a structured world. On the other hand, if you only had Yehi Oyer and Yehi Rakia, you didn't have Bereshis Bara, it wouldn't be aligned necessarily with the Ratzon Hashem. So you need both. You need the Klali, the Ratzon Klali, and then you need the specifics as they establish themselves. So everything comes from the Atzmus in that sense. But the way they emerge, they have different functions. That's really what is getting to right here. So Ratzon has a very different type of functionality, and therefore relationship with the Nefesh than does Seichel. And he's saying not only with the Nefesh, but even with the Koyches Atzmim. Okay. Dini Yadua. Okay. So now I was going to explain this in detail. I think we should stop here unless somebody wants to ask something, because I don't want to start a sentence and not finish it. Because he's going to go now into discussing all this about seichel, how exactly these functions work. And this is all going to come back to teach us about Oyer and Yesh and its relationship with Atzmus and so on. So I'm going to stop reading right now from right here. Read a few lines into the new paragraph on page 1156. So though we've learned this, it's still, as I said, quite well worth going over it again. But I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything or comment. When I hear such silence from such articulate people, I feel like everybody is stunned by the sheer power of the Rebbe Rashab's message here.
Jacobson,
Yeah.
If you find someone that has some hardship in revealing his ratzon, his will, is there anything that we can do to reveal it, to help him reveal it? So sometimes, what do you want in life? No, I don't know. It just goes. He goes, he learns, but doesn't reveal. He's not connected to his will. What can be done to correct this?
How about his other faculties? How are they functioning? Like
Very well. Intellectual, very well.
I got it. I understand. Unfortunately, it's a big problem that many people have because I think, first of all, most of the Western education does not teach us to think in terms of a mission in life except making money or building a business or things like that, or family. And the idea that you are sent here to this earth, la'avda l'shamra, to serve, and you must find your mission in life, a shlichus in life. That neshama is, yididus and neshama beguf is a shlichus, it's not common today in most education systems. So you have to first identify why this person doesn't have that connection. Is it ignorance and they need to be educated? Is it they get distracted with life as it goes on, with whether it's making money or other pleasures in this world, and they're not interested in deeper purpose? Or is it something deeper, like, for example, people who are very traumatized and have been hurt, and they're very afraid to go find purpose, and they just keep life on a very low burner, just maintenance, like survival mode. So it's hard to answer without knowing. This is something I deal with all the time. It's very much part of all my work, is helping people find that rotzen, as you put it, that mission, that passion. Now, everybody has one, and everybody it can be ignited. You have to find it. Look, we all start our lives not necessarily knowing what our shlichus may be. So I don't have a quick answer for this question. I just know that you have to look at it very sensitively, case by case, to see the individual situation. Look, many people who came to Yiddishkeit, who grew up, let's say, in a secular world, one of the things that drew them, they saw a life and a community and a Torah that's driven by purpose, like a purpose-driven life, a mission-driven life. It's a very compelling thing when you live in a world where that doesn't exist, at least not in language. And the most you can achieve is being a successful business person, maybe building a nice home and family. But I would submit you can't really be successful unless you have a deeper mission in life. But you see millions of people wandering around, and even now during the pandemic, and many don't have a clue where they're going or where they're coming from. I'm not saying it critically, it's just a fact of life. So I would look at this very individually to see how you inspire someone. To me, it comes down to you come and you get inspired by the fact that you are here for a purpose. Why are you here? Now, I would like to believe everybody wants to have an answer to that question, but some people are distracted, or they don't have the tools, or they were never taught. So I can't give a beyond that answer. Will mention that in the volume 1 in Ayin Beis, he did speak about an illness called, I think he called it mania, where a person has all the faculties functioning, but the rotzen is just not there. they're almost like not motivated, like a certain type of like depression even. I'm not sure what that illness is in English language, but just pointing out that there is such a thing. And but that I would not suggest that people who don't have that rotzen have an illness. That's not where you begin. That's the last step. If there's no other way to explain it, that may be a factor. But in most cases, I really believe people were not exposed and therefore not made aware of this importance of finding that passion and finding that rotzen. And this is very much part of what our shlichus is to help people find and discover what is Rosh Hashanah at the end of the day. It's reclaiming, renewing our contract with Hashem. Like we say every day, what are we saying? Thank you for returning my soul to me and giving me a renewed contract for another day or another year, and for many healthy years, to fulfill my mission in life. How many people have that feeling and sentiment?
Even people that are religious. We always had a Rebbe to go to and set us straight and give us our specifics.
Well, you know what? Since we're already talking Lashon Hara on the Jewish people, I'll say this. There are many people, even when the Rebbe physically was here, yes, it was easy to ride on the Rebbe's coattails, but that type of driving passion, we all have a Yetzer Hara, and we all have our agendas. So yes, it may have been a little easier then, but I'll be very honest. I mean, I always tell Bochrim and others who ask me, so what was it like before Gimel Tammuz? I always tell them the Yetzer Hara was quite active then too. Just be aware. It didn't begin after Gimel Tammuz. My point is that a Rebbe could only do that much. A Rebbe can provide, like the Rebbe says, he can provide the match, he can give direction, inspiration, motivation. But at the end of the day, you have to make that choice as an adult that you're going to join the army, so to speak. You're going to mobilize yourself and say, yes, my life is going to be focused towards the mission for which God sent me here. It's not that simple. Even within the religious community, even within Chabad, many people get busy with their work. And the explanation is they're doing the Masa Matan Bamuna. I'm not criticizing it. Make parnasa, support their families, high tuition rates. Life is expensive. And sometimes that becomes an end in itself. And that's why you need to have shiurim and learning chitas and Rambam and all the mifsoim and all the things we do to keep our head above water, to make sure that our focus is not just on the means, but on the end. In another way of articulating mission or ratzon and so on. Like I said, you can do all the mitzvahs, netilas, lulav, and matzah, and forget that there's an Eibishter. Let's not forget that too. You need Hashem. You can forget there's a God. You know how many people I've asked who told me they can't go to shul. Now things are a little different, but remember a few months ago. So I said, why do you want to go to shul? Because you want to go, because God wants you to go. And people think, you know what, I think it's more because I want to go. Because if God wants you to be on a desert island, or he wants you to be on the moon, or he wants you to be at home for a Seder, or Rosh Hashanah, whatever it may be, it may not be what we like, but God runs the show. So who decides? What's the Ratzon Hashem is what's the gay here, not whether you're comfortable or not. So my point is, this question you're bringing up really is relevant to all of us at all times, especially when we're challenged. But I appreciate the question, and I think it's a good question. It's very much a type of chassidus applied, and a type of like applying these ideas to our lives. So that's why the end of this class worthwhile talking about. Okay, so with that, let us stop here.